thank you. Good evening, and welcome to the Hanson Finance Committee meeting of March 30th, 2021. I will entertain a motion to open.
Motion.
Second.
Moved by Mrs. Werdeman. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Mrs. Wright. We'll do a roll call vote. Mr. Dugan,
Aye.
Mr. McCormick,
Aye.
Mr. Powers,
Aye.
Mrs. Wright,
Aye.
Mrs. Werdeman,
Aye.
Mr. Sullivan, aye. We are open for business. All right, thanks everyone for joining. Tonight we have one person on the agenda, the final person I'll say that we need to have discussions with before we start down the path of modifying or finalizing a budget. We're about a month out, as John and I realized this morning, I think on the phone. We're coming to the end here, so this will be our not our final opportunity, but one of our last opportunities to have John sit down with us and give us an overview of where we are. I had sent out all the additional budget information earlier in the week to give everyone some time over the weekend to review, make any questions, comments, concerns. So, John, with that, I'll turn it over to you. If there's anything you want to highlight briefly that I'll say that might have changed since I think it was Friday was when I sent out the documents that you forwarded along, and then not too long, just a brief overview where we need to be, where we're at, and then I know the rest of the committee is anxiously awaiting some questions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to be here tonight, talking with everyone. So right now, as of today, the deficit is $2,181,208. There's been some changes back and forth in the budgets, and I sent along a short synopsis of how we got to there. Obviously, that's a large amount, and it's something it will be very difficult to close if we don't get an override. If you remember, every $1 million on the fiscal year 21's tax rate is about $250. So something like 2.1 million is north of $500. So it's a little bit more than that. The sheet that I sent out earlier just had some budget steps that we could take to try to lower some of those things, and we can to that amount of 2.1 million to a lower amount, but it's not going to go much lower than like 1.86 or something like that. And if we were to do some of these things, so I mean, I'm here really just to kind of give answer questions, and we could go over these things that's on the sheet, whatever you'd like to do.
And that's the I think it was labeled the what if sheet that I sent you all this afternoon, and that was what John and I had discussed were, we'll say, the initial steps that would get us down to either a straight override amount without diving into any further deeper cuts within the town. Correct, John?
Yes, and that's also with a certain set of assumptions that we could go over if you'd like. But one of the things was no free cash or raise and appropriate money going to the recreation department this year, using free cash to fill the transfer station budget fully, and also using their retained earnings to fund some of their budget. Again, that's just where we are right now is we have to come up with a scenario. Town accountant Todd Hassett and I worked most of today on coming up with something that we're going to be trying to present to a joint committee meeting of the Board of Selectmen and your committee, if you so are inclined, next Tuesday. So it's taking a while to go through every single cut, but we need to come up with around $1.8 million in cuts if the override were to fail.
Okay. All right. Thank you, John. Obviously there's a lot of data, a lot of information out there on the street. So that's why I sent all the sheets out to give everyone time to sort of review their questions. So With that being said, I guess we can we'll go down the list. We'll go, one at a time, and then we can circle back just to get any going. So, Mr. Dugan, we'll start with questions for the town administrator.
I do. I wanted to start with, in looking at, I think it was just labeled fiscal 22, operating budget that was kind of department by department with the summaries at the bottom. This kind of relates to us and FinCom. The rationale for us increasing the reserve fund by 50,000, where we're thinking of needing to cut in other departments and I get the fact that, 50,000 against $1.8 million is the infamous deck chair off the Titanic. But having said that, I also, if whoever's paying attention, find it a little disingenuous that we're going to be theoretically, unless an override passes, proposing budgets that would cut everywhere else, and we've increased the reserve fund by 50,000. Do we have a rationale for why we wanted to do that? Or is this, kind of the last gasp fund if things are needed throughout the course of the year? I mean, just from my perspective of for your history, 4 years ago, Kevin, check me if I'm wrong on this, that reserve fund for the entire year had been at 75,000. So
Yes.
this is in theory doubling it in 2 years. I mean, in roughly 4 years.
Yes, it was 75, and then we bumped it
Went
up
to
to
90, and then we went to 100,
100.
and now to 150.
Go ahead, John.
Okay, so the thinking there is that, at least my thinking, and I believe it's Todd's as well, is that we're cutting things as close as we possibly can to the bonus, and we would need a finance committee reserve fund transfer fund just in case something happens in between town meetings. So adding to the 50,000 is something where I mean, it's there's a rule of thumb that you try to get 1% of the operating budget in the reserve fund. That's what the Department of Revenue will has when they have guidelines that they come in and give you. We're not near that at all, and I think that the additional money in there was something that will get us through in between town meetings if something catastrophic were to happen. But again, this is just a scenario. If that was something that you wanted to propose to cut 50,000 there, we could add that into some of them and lower the override amount. But I think it should be in there for the what if scenarios that might happen.
And so that was that's a good point, John. Is I think the thought was when Todd put it in there was that give it where everything's going to be so tight to give us a bigger safety net, because 50 grand on a 1.8. But yeah, no, I think it's something we should definitely look at trimming it out.
Like for example, where we were talking last week with if we were looking at 10% across the board and we're cutting 14,000 out of Beth's budget, again, in terms of stretching that across, I have a little tough time taking 14,000 out of her budget and adding 50 to ours. But if you stretch that 50 across every department, what does that really translate out to? So I get it. I think that we are in such a hole that the catastrophic piece of it, I think we're kind of already there. We're trying to find $1.8 million, of which we won't. And from where I sit, I think having a hard view of where we expect the budget to end up without that support is probably going to be the more realistic view of things. Just take a look at where we were a year ago, asking the town for support of an override of 800,000 that went down in flames. And now you're asking to more than double it. And that's really kind of the best we can do without cutting things. Certainly not trying to speak for the whole town, but I don't have a warm and fuzzy feeling about the support this is going to receive. And I really think we need to plan for the future going accordingly without that fund.
So John, unless someone else disagrees, maybe we'll add that to the what if scenarios. Add that 50, and I'll say, I can send notes on this tomorrow, so you don't have to worry about it. That could be a step, just sort of, like you said, 50 grand isn't going to move the needle that much, but it's a step in the right direction. So we can add that to the scenario just to show that, no town department is going to be untouched by this. So we'll have to see where we go and just, hope for the best. We're still doing pretty well this year with the reserve fund, and we'll take a look at that going forward. Mr. Dugan, any other?
Mr. Dugan, that was one of my concerns as well too. Sorry, it's not my turn, but
That's fine. That's fine. Mr. Dugan, other questions?
If you want to go on to the next, I'll catch you on the way back.
Mr. McCormick.
I don't. I agree with Mike. 1.86 million is going to be hard to find or get. I guess a couple questions would be, have we used all the CARES money?
It's all been obligated, but we haven't spent it all yet, no.
Right. And do we know what our share of the American Relief Act will be?
Yes, I had that at the selectmen's meeting last week. I can send that to you. There's some direct aid to the town, and then there's also aid to the county that should flow back to the town.
Okay.
I'm drawing a blank on the amount now, but it's something like $1 million direct to the town and something north of that through the county.
Are those, with that money, that whatever that number was, are those figured into the numbers that you currently have to make things work or not work?
No, they are not.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I honestly think that it's good. We can look at the paperwork that you sent out, Kevin, which was exhausting to look at in itself. But I think without sitting down with the meeting that John was talking about with the selectmen and find out exactly what page we're all going to be on and find out where we want to go. We watched it happen last year. So we could do it all and it'd be for naught. Or we could have done it wrong or not the way they wanted to do it. So I think we should all be on the same page and then try to do the best we can. I agree that we're not going to find 1.86 million. So
yeah, and I think part of the issue is, and I was thinking about it today when John and I were talking, the what if scenarios he's included where we can trim some minor aspects out of it. There may be a real possibility that we have to, if this 1.8 number is the number we need to put an override in for, because if we don't put it in enough of an override next year, we're going to be in the same exact position because everything's going to increase. At some point, we're going to have to expend money on capital. And I know we haven't really seen that, John. And I think we're taking a pass on pretty much a lot of the capital items this year. That's correct. Yes,
if the override fails, then yes, we will just be. Although we do have the town bylaw that says that we're supposed to spend 1% of the budget on capital. So we're going to have to at some point find, again, round the numbers off, $300,000 to spend on capital. Again, Todd and I are working on that, but right now we don't have 300,000 to spend. We're seeing what we can do.
yeah, I mean, I think we have to have that one more meeting, I think, and then kind of get on the same page, figure out where they are, figure out where we are. They're going to have a better feel, although I think all of us, I'm going to speak for the committee, have a pretty good feel of how this will crash and burn. But they may have a better feeling on how an override would work or what an actual number is that we need to come up with. There's 1.86, I don't consider, but that's just my take.
Any other questions, Mr. McCormick?
No, I think I'm good now, Kevin. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Powers, you don't look that tan.
No, I don't. That's SPF 50, thankfully. The
Spoken like a true Irishman.
hey, I'll stay in the shade. If I can come back paler, it's a victory for me. The so I guess a question I might have for you, John, do you see, looking at some of the options that we have, right? And I've stood up in town meetings in the past couple of years and said this over and over again. I mean, I think as a committee, we've done our best to send up our warning flares and the SOS over the last couple of years and saying, this is coming, this is coming, this is coming. Well, it's here. We have a pretty large number to try to find, and there's only so many cuts we can make, right? And 50,000 here or there is going to help if we need it in a pinch, but sustainability wise, it's just not a long-term option, right? We have more expenses. We're kicking the can on some of the capital stuff. We've put 6 figures into a wheel that isn't spinning right now down at the mill over the last couple of years. And I believe in the heritage of this town. I know I didn't grow up here, but I've lived here long enough that, I think it's a great town, and I love living here and having my family here and my kids go to the schools here. But we've also passed on revenue sources and some other opportunities. Realistically, we can raise taxes, we can do overrides, and we can cut the bare bones. But I think we've cut what we can cut over the last couple of years with the way things are going. Do you see, looking ahead, not just this year, but long term, are there other realistic revenue avenues? And I know some are controversial and people have already voted and people are going to blast me on the blogosphere for this stuff, but aside from maybe recreational, marijuana or any of those things, are there other revenue sources we can even start to look at long-term down the road to help us out as a town? Because right now it's either going to be cut, or raise taxes. And we already saw the last override or some of the last attempts to get a little more money to cover the gaps kind of crash and burn. And I'm afraid if it happens again, we're in serious trouble.
The only 2 things I can think of right off the top of my head would be, again, like you were talking about, the cannabis, and that's very controversial. There is going to be an article on the annual town meeting to expand the definition to a lot of cannabis retail to allow for delivery. With delivery, we get a 3% like a tax, like a surtax on based on the agreement. We also get a 3% sales tax. I know that's what a lot of people don't want to hear, but is substantial money. Cannabis is very expensive. That's a lot of money. The only other thing I can think of off the top of my head would be adoption of the local meals tax. I don't know how much that would benefit the town. If there's enough to make it worthwhile, it wouldn't be anything that would, it wouldn't be hundreds of thousands. It would probably be in the 5-figure amounts, but it could mean something. Other than that, there's not a lot going on unless we were to drive development long-term down around the train station, and get some extra tax revenue out of that. But that's long-term. That's not going to be happening in the next year or 2. That would be 5 years from now, probably, when we'd see that.
No, fair enough. And I think in the name of, I get both sides of all the different issues, and I think of the people that live here, everybody loves the town for the most part, and I think some people love low taxes, maybe a little bit more, and I get that, right? I'm not one that wants to shell out my money from a tax percentage, but at some point, right, this is a revenue versus expense issue, and it always has been, and it's bubbling over. I wish, I think as a committee, and I won't speak on behalf of the committee, I'm just speaking on behalf of myself. I mean, I think we've sent up these warning shots. It's going to come down to see how people vote in this town meeting, because no matter what we recommend as we come out of here, it's not going to matter until people raise their hand one way or the other in a couple of weeks, right? And then again later in the year. So hopefully folks will have a chance to dig into these issues themselves a little bit and realize that we've been giving the warning sign now. I think, Mike, you gave the the deck chair over into the water on the Titanic. This might be the point where, you know, they're bribing people to get on the lifeboats at some point. I don't know. The band's still playing, but you know, we're getting close to having water all over the deck, so we'll see what happens. That's it. I'm done ranting. Back to you, Kevin.
Thanks. Mrs. Werdeman, questions for the town administrator?
Yeah, sure. So obviously, I mean, I agree with what everybody's saying. One question that I have is, what is the legal services expenses that went from 140 to 160?
That's the amount of money that the town spends for town council and town labor council. So they do everything from, you know, town meeting, they make sure that all the articles that I write are legal. Also labor council, if we have negotiations with unions. It's also zoning, the marijuana bylaw, things like that. I just did that. I checked that account probably 3 hours ago. And there might be some savings there. We thought that last year, fiscal year 20, that was a very high number. I've been able to keep that in a lower amount. So that might be something that we might be able to look at. I just found that out today, but that's in general, that's what it is. It's any legal services for that town council is needed throughout the town. It's everybody but water.
Okay, so that 160 number was just kind of a ballpark going up 20 grand that we could probably maybe save on?
It was last year was a very high amount for different reasons in that system. So that was a number that I put in, and now looking at it, it might be higher than it should be, as long as things continue to go well legally.
Okay. I'm just, like everybody said, like trying to look at like all the little numbers that are going to eventually add up. So
I agree with that. I don't think we're not going to find $1.8 million somewhere, but we might find 5 $40,000 ones and try to bite into it. So I agree with that thinking.
Yeah, that's all I got, because a lot of my questions were already answered. So
Okay, thank you. Mrs. Wright?
Yeah, I don't really have any questions. I just, you know, I think that it is definitely going to be a hard sell for an override, but I think that, you know, once the decision is made and we have a number, that, you know, the town has to do a really good job of explaining to everybody, like, what the backup plan is if the override doesn't pass. Like, you know what I mean? Like explaining exactly whether we decide, or, you know, with Board of Selectmen, that we're taking 10% off of everybody's budgets or whatever. Like, I think that needs to be like a clear and concise message to the town so that they completely understand what the outcome is without an override. It's really, there's no way we're going to find the money to, you know, come up with almost $2 million. So that's really the only thing I have to say.
Okay, thank you, Mrs. Wright. Anyone have any by the ways I just thought of that you want? Mr. Dugan?
I'm back.
Please.
Two things that I just wanted to clarify or kind of get an understanding of. In kind of like the what if scenario for the 178,000 for solid waste, looks like that was 118 from free cash, and they were going to use 60,000 from retained earnings. Does that blow out their retained earnings? I guess I'm more interested in where does that stand on, call it July 1, of what we potentially would be looking at. And this begs the old question that we as a committee talk about in terms of that still being an enterprise fund. If the retained earnings are going to be down to zero, it's a situation where it's a cost center versus a revenue producer. where do we then just kind of say it's better off as a town department instead of an enterprise fund?
So yes, that will get their retained earnings down to almost zero. We're going to need that in order to keep their budget going at the level that they wanted to fund it at. If we were able to save anything, this is my opinion, but I think we should save and not use free cash and have them use their own money in the retained earnings. As we look at their budget, but whether it should be an enterprise fund or not, I guess enterprise funds are made to stand on their own, and it's up to the people to decide whether or not recreation and transfer station stand on their own. If right now they're not, but they have in the past, so I'm not sure whether they'll come back to profitability, whatever profitability is, generating retained earnings, or if you think that won't happen, then maybe it is time to put it in put them in as town departments.
Okay, and the second question, to kind of follow-up point, is in looking at the what ifs in terms of the school budget, given that that's the biggest animal we're looking to tackle. With that, there's one number, then there was an increase, decrease. Do we have any general feeling of where we stand on that in terms of this is where we are and we're going to have to work with it, or are we still in discussions over, kind of based on where we are today, we can't afford the whole number. I guess just if you could provide us with an update as to where we might stand on that.
So in the budget right now is the amount that they released, I think it was 2 weeks ago. So again, they could always meet and lower that amount if they chose to do that. Any number that they do that they can cut on their end it's a 1-for-1. It's a savings on our end. Actually, Whitman saves as well, obviously. So it would behoove us to get back together with them and especially me, and make sure that they are giving us the best deal, so to speak. I'm thinking that again, I'm not sure about. I have talked to the new Whitman town administrator, and I need to talk to them more and figure out exactly what he is looking for in his budget. Again, he's only been there, I don't know, 6-7 weeks. But I think if there's savings to be had there, we need to have it. There's no way that we can't, right, the amount that's there now, we can't sustain it. So there's got to be some sort of cuts. It has to be substantial. It's got to be something like, again, $750,000 top level, so that rolls to $300,000 or some number like that, a real cut, or we wouldn't be able to, we would use every single dollar that we have. And then what would we do next year in fiscal year 23? So I guess that's a long-winded answer to your question, but.
No, I don't think so. I think it just by way of general history with us, we've been in a situation where, in terms of talking with Whitman and what can we do, what can they do type discussions. And I'm going to make some arbitrary numbers, but it's been one of these, when the initial number comes out, it's an 18% increase. We say we're only going to be comfortable with a 3% increase. And then those two kind of back and forth until we get to, called 10%. And that gets settled on. I think we've always talked about trying to eliminate weeks of that back and forth. This is kind of what we can afford. Are we going to be able to do this or not? And this, maybe I'm jumping the gun in terms of the rest of the discussion with you, and I think this kind of goes back to Ken's point in terms of, I don't want to see us as a committee spin our wheels trying to find a couple of dollars here. What can we do about there? And you and the Board of Selectmen have a different way of thinking of, this is how we're going to try and solve this problem. It's if we can get to that number, that's going to say, this is what we can afford. And I'm going to, again, make up numbers. It's $200,000 difference than what's presented now. Then that alters our thinking in terms of how we're trying to present future cuts to get to that number. So that one is kind of the biggest animal in the room, and kind of where are we from a general thought process in terms of trying to get to that number? Is it labor reductions? Is it general expense? Is it pulling back on some other things? We've talked kind of, what is the most fair thing to say? Is it, every department needs to be able to have a 10% haircut? These are things that, as we're trying to present a budget as prepared by the finance committee, where does town administrator stand on these? Where does the board of selectmen stand? And going back to Ken's point, does it make sense to have this as one big discussion?
I think it works if we, on the 6th, we talk about this, as a joint, with you and the Board of Selectmen. We'll have, by then, Todd and I will have worked out all the numbers, and we'll have a number to present. So that would be the number. April 6th is the last time the Board of Selectmen are going to be meeting before an override is required to be given to the town clerk with an actual number on it. So that's next Tuesday is pretty much it. That's whatever number gets decided there will be, I'll have it to the town clerk at the next day, so that we can get it in under the wire of the law. So I think we'll have it, and we can maybe go back and forth about how to come up to that number with cuts. But it's going to be personnel. It's going to be a large amount. It's going to be, again, we've talked about this several times with the Board of Selectmen. It's going to be police officers. It's going to be firefighters. That's where the money is, unfortunately. It's going to be highway workers. It's going to be every department. It's going to be town hall, and it's going to be using every dollar that we have that's available, and which is not sustainable, as you all know. So if it doesn't pass, and then we have to next year try to find, even if we made all the cuts, there's still going to be a large amount of one-time revenue, and that's going to have to be used again in the following years. And that one-time revenue won't be there because we're cutting the budget as closely as we are. So it's a spiral downward that could continue if the override were not to pass.
I have a question. It's Amy. So if you guys decided to do something like adding the sales, the local sales tax, for that to be implemented anytime soon, that would have to be on the warrant for this year, right?
Yes.
Have there been any discussions about putting that on there so there is some additional revenue next year to be added to the budget, or no?
The Board of Selectmen have not discussed it, no. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I know. You were just saying that those were like two ways to, get additional income into the town. I was just wondering if maybe that's a thought that we can, relay to them, to maybe add an article to try and pass that in order to get, maybe it's only $200,000 or something, but it's, it's a little bit more money at the end of, next fiscal year to add to the town's budget. Or is it even something that would be even possible at this point, do you think?
I think it's a lot of moving pieces right now, Amy. And I know what you're saying. It's a great idea, and maybe we should have thought of this a year ago. I just don't know if overnet. There's a certain proclivity of this town to keep taxes low, to push an override as well as a meal tax.
I understand that, but if you go to Abington and you get a coffee, you're paying the sales tax when you get your coffee there. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, every town around us has that small.
No, I understand.
Tax,
I'm saying that this might be something for the fall. to give time for debate.
Yeah.
I got to be honest, I think a lot of the small business and restaurants in town took a pretty harsh beating over this last year. I get it long term, and I know it was just, I don't think, John, you were suggesting it as this is the way we have to go. It's just one of the potential opportunities, right? When you brainstorm and throwing sticky notes up on the wall, that's sometimes you throw up sticky notes that might not be feasible long term. I don't know if I'd support putting something like that on the, how I'd vote with it just based on seeing what these restaurants have gone through. But it's unfortunate that we've come to even your point, like, and I think I said this earlier, we've come to a point where we have to look at every solution. And I know I made a wisecrack about the wheel spinning and spending a couple $100,000 on that over the last few years. It's not that I don't support that. I support the historical part. I want to be able to support our transfer station. There's folks that are paying for private hauling that are subsidizing by not using it and not creating an expense there for them, but they're still paying into it with their taxes, right? We have Camp Kawani, which is one of the greatest things from a nature perspective. I know we purge and everything else, but that we own as a town, and the fact that we can't give them the funds that we just don't have the money to give them the funds they need to make it even better than it already is. And that crew there is doing an incredible job trying to figure out how to go along on their shoestring budget. It's just we're now at a point where if we can find 25,000 here, 50,000 there, like at what cost, right? Long-term effects that's going to have on some of these departments and some of these budgets, they're already down to the bare minimum. And now we're asking them to go without even more. I just don't see it as right in my opinion. And it's unfortunate that I think a lot of people, we had a huge attendance 2 town meetings ago and a really light one, the one right after, because of what was on the agenda. And it'll be interesting to see what the turnout is for this one, but hopefully enough people show up to get their voices heard. If not, it's going to be a few select people making decisions for the town, and we're all going to have to live with the consequences, good or bad. So that's just my opinion.
Okay, so thank you for that. Are there any final questions for the town administrator? I want to let him go. We can continue the discussion and debate afterwards. I just want to make sure. I know Mr. Stanbrook has taken some time, the time to be here, and I just want to make sure we get all of our questions answered. So are there any final questions from the committee before we let the town administrator go?
I just got a couple, Kevin, they're pretty quick.
Please go ahead, Mr. McCormick.
John, do we know what the school saved during the COVID period from 20 to 21 with substitute teachers and the transportation issues and lack of using the school? Was there a number that they saved, and was that given back to the town through that last year's budget? Would be number one. And number two, with our shortfall, how much of it is COVID and how much of it is the statutory method?
The first question, I have not seen any number come back from the town, from the schools. We didn't get any rebate or anything in 20 or 21. I don't know how much they spent on COVID. I know the amount that I've set aside from the CARES Act money for costs that they have. And that's something like I'm looking at the board here in my office because I have the amount. They've already received $172,774.36 from CARES, and they've got 2 other pending for about $173,000 that have been sent in but haven't been reimbursed yet because the county's a little bit behind on sending the money back. They also have placeholders in the COVID money. I'm sorry, in the CARES Act money of about $760,000. And then another earmark from a state grant for $400,000, $200,000 from the House, I believe, and $200,000 from the state, from the Senate, which the county agreed to fund. So let's see, 1.1 million of the CARES Act hasn't been submitted yet. What has been submitted and received are about 172,000, and what's been submitted but hasn't been processed yet, it's about 173,000. So whatever those numbers added up. And what was the second question?
The second one is our shortfall.
Yes. Oh, how much is that? Is CARES related?
Well,
Yes.
how much of that is COVID?
COVID related.
Loss in revenue through COVID, and then how much of that is the whole either COVID or statutory? What is the biggest percent? Is it statutory method just put us where we are?
The entire deficit isn't the statutory method, but it's, the majority. 65, again, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but 65%. So, it's the statutory is most, I guess it's fair to say most of it, but it isn't all of it. There is some other things that are in there.
All right, thank you. That's it. I'm all set.
Anyone else? Any final questions from Mr. Stanbrook? Seeing none. John, thank you very much for your time. We appreciate you coming on here. Always a pleasure to have you, and we got you in and out under an hour, and it wasn't too bad of a grilling, right?
Thank you very much for inviting me. I wish I could come more. I'm an old finance committee person from way back. That's how I got my start. So I understand and how important it is, and I've been where you are. So thank you.
Thank
you, John.
Have a good night.
Thanks, John.
All right, so thank you, everyone. I appreciate everyone reviewing the material ahead of time and having those questions on there. I didn't want to leave it too open-ended because I'm sure we could have probably sat there and chatted with him for 2-3 hours. But I think he and I spoke earlier today. The selectmen are interested in having a group meeting, and I think as we heard at that group meeting, is where we're going to come to a consensus on what the override amount will be. And that way we don't spend our time spinning our wheels, digging into this, clearing out, doing 3 or 4 iterations of this. So I believe I sent all of you out. I don't know if I did the override calculator, which will give you the amounts based on, where we are and where we're going. So we can play around with that and look at how the numbers change. I think a good question is what's a realistic, my fear is that even if we were able to cut a huge amount out of this budget and go for a much lower override, it's going to put us right back in the same place next year because we need this increase. We're going to need a pretty significant override. I'd love to say that this was only a $500,000 override and we could sell it real easy and just get us over the hump and would be fine. But my concern is that this is now growing exponentially every year. And this hole is going to get exponentially bigger until we have to do something real. I think last year when we crunched the numbers and looked at it, it was the $800,000 override would have set us up, would have covered the deficit and set us up for this year. Well, we didn't do that. Now the hole's bigger. So we need a bigger bridge. But, I think that's where I would ask everyone to look at the documents we've received already and come to that meeting on Tuesday night, ready to finalize, ready to settle on a number. I'm not saying it's one everyone's going to be comfortable with, but I think we need to be realistic about it. The total deficit right now, I think, was 1.862. Is that what I think? That's what I sent. I'm sorry. Necessary override would be 1.862. I think, Mike, if we lower the reserve fund, we get to 1.8. 1. So, in my mind, what's a realistic number? Can we get down to a $1.5 million override? I think that, to me, 1.5, I think, is the number that, to me, is realistic.
What is it? It's $250 per $1 million per household. Is that what it is?
Yes.
On figures, yeah.
So right now, if you were to look at it, and I said, 1.862, if we had to go for the full 1.862 million, it would be an increase of $461. That's based on a single family home valuation of $367,000. So anyone's house who was valued under that would pay less than $460. Anyone over more than 460. So that's the 1.862. It would be a $461 increase on everyone's taxes. If you drop it to 1.5, that goes down to $371. So 300, less than $400, less than, I hate to say it, I know a lot of people struggled this year. You're looking at less than $100 per quarterly tax bill increase. So to me, that's the number that allows us to make the cuts, that allows us to, hopefully, if we get some of the money back in the school, that's just that's where I'm looking at it. I think down to $1 million, I don't know if we'll get there. And again, I think we're setting ourselves up. So that's sort of my thoughts on it. Any comments?
I like your thinking. I kind of,
Yeah.
I think that's something to shoot for. I think that's a little too much, but I do, I like where you're going with it. And with that, I need to split because my other job is calling me.
Okay.
Understood.
Thank
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
What are other people's thoughts on that rationale?
I like where your head's at with it, and
Yeah.
obviously anything we can do to get it down, great. I think you might have even said this earlier. Like, I don't want to swing too low because are we going to be right back into the same problem next year? I mean, this is something that, in my opinion, hindsight always being 2020. Looking back a few years ago, some of these problems were probably preventable, but based on the way votes occurred, we're here where we are today, and this is the situation we're in, right? So we're at another point where, depending on how this votes go, having issues next year, the year after, are definitely maybe not preventable at this point, but we can certainly soften the blow if we have the right approach to it. So whatever our number comes in, it's a tough pill to swallow anyway, and a lot of people are going to be ticked off, and they're going to be mad at us as a committee. They're going to be mad at the select board. They're going to be mad at the town for raising taxes or suggesting raising taxes, and it's going to be everybody else's fault. But the reality is we've had a contingent of people that have pushed to vote things down in the past, and the way those votes have gone have put us in the situation we're in now. And it's a direct result of those, because we as a finance committee, we actually don't determine the final number, right? The town does. The board of selectmen and women don't determine the final number. The votes do. So we're here because of those votes, and I want to make sure that's out there and that's clear. So it'll be interesting to see how those votes go. But to your point, I think from a suggestion standpoint, I just want to make sure we don't come out too low, because we'll get blamed for that problem next year too, right? We're blamed for this one, we'll be blamed for the next one. But I'd rather be blamed for coming in a little too high than having another gap to fill next year. So.
Yeah.
Well, it's so true, because people don't, when they vote, they don't actually know all the facts, as we've seen. So it's kind of like, but.
I think some do, and they choose to
ignore the facts.
They choose to ignore them, and I think a lot of people might not, and I don't necessarily blame them for not knowing, because they're, we have a contingent that shows up that day and figures out how they're going to vote that day. We have a contingent that reads through all the social media posts. We have a contingent that watches these on YouTube and pays attention and shows up to meetings. And regardless of how people vote, either way, whatever their cause or background is, we have to go with how the town votes, and that's the way the world works, or at least our world. And I totally support whatever the outcome is, right? I was a proponent for recreational stuff in the past because I thought it was going to give us revenue. I stood up in several town meetings and said, hey, if not, we're going to have a problem. Yeah, guess what? I hate to say I told you so, but here's where we're at. And I'm not saying that's our only solution out of this. This isn't a rant to like, hey, we need to look back into this. It's what else can we do? If it's not that, fine. But what else can it be? Because at some point we can't shut down our fire department. We can't shut down our police station.
We need
can
options.
Shut down recreation. We can shut down the transfer station. I don't want to be the one responsible for that. I sure as hell don't, because I think they're valuable assets to this town if funded and run and taxed for appropriately. But we're not in those situations right now, right? Anyways, sorry, I'll get off the soapbox. I'm just
Mr. Dugan.
No, I was just going to add to the short-term memories of the voting public. And where I'm going with this is the question will be, where did this number come from? How did we get to this thing? And again, while every department has contractual increases, there's stuff that's just going to go up that we need to deal with. I be remiss if I didn't remind everybody that, again, we had, in trying to go from, and this goes to Ken's question of is it statutory or not from the school system? Let's keep in mind that the agreement from Whitman last year allowed us to, instead of coming up with $1.3 million for the school, it was only 800. That Whitman provided us that $500,000, but said, we'll help you this year, but you're on your own next year as part of that agreement. So by default, before we even looked at one number for this budget cycle, we were already in the hole 500,000. So while I don't disagree with the general comment that future budgets are going to continue to escalate, I think this year is a little bit of an abnormality simply because of that $500,000 hole that we started out with on day one.
Mrs. Wright, Mrs. Werdeman, anything to add?
Nope, I'm good.
Okay, so I think, and we're sort of, I don't want to say we're out of time. The selectmen want to meet next week, Tuesday, and as John mentioned, they have to get a number to Beth to put on the ballot, because there is a time that's time sensitive. And I believe that's the last time they're going to meet. They're the ones that actually decide on the number in the override. And so I'd sort of like to come to a loose consensus here on what we think is that number, because they're going to ask, we're going to discuss it next week, but ultimately we don't decide what that override number is, right? The selectmen are going to choose the override number and put it on the ballot question. They're going to give it to the town clerk. She'll publish the ballots or get the ballots drawn up. Obviously we're not comfortable with any of this, but we need to come up with a number. So, I'll say the committee more inclined to go the full 1.8, or is it 1.5 a more reasonable?
I think in my opinion, I think 1.5. Because if the what if was the 1.8 and then you're trimming a little bit here and there, I think 1.5, in my opinion.
Okay. And that 1.862 was the trimmed number. We'll say it's 1,812,750, assuming we reduce the reserve fund by that 50% and bring it back to the 100. So Mr. Dugan, your thoughts on that 1.5?
This is a poor choice of words, but in one sense, I feel like we're just throwing a dart against the wall based on coming up with a number that we think would be supported by the town. And if I'm being perfectly honest with the committee, 1.3, 1.5, 1.8, I just from past experience don't think that there's a whole lot of difference between those numbers, because I just, call me negative, I don't see the support on that at the ballot. That being said, what is a reasonable number? Well, what's a reasonable number in terms of getting that extra 300,000 out of the budget to get to the 1.5, assuming that would pass? Are we comfortable saying that we think between some other cuts, in terms of, say, the reduction in the reserve fund, final negotiations with the school, we can get from 1.8 to 1.5? Is there a comfort level there? I mean, that's kind of question number one, to say, am I supportive of that 1.5?
Yeah. So I think I've been looking at it, and I'll say how I settled on the 1.5 was, a reduction in the school number. Obviously, it's not going to be a huge amount. I think Whitman's in better shape. I know they might be running a slight deficit. So you got to figure, okay, we can probably get the maybe 300 K reduction from there. Then I think getting the other 100 and 150 K, we could make those adjustments to the current budget that we have through without having to make any major personnel changes. You know, I think we could go in there and trim and fine and scrimp and go back on expenses to keep people employed. And so that's the number that I felt comfortable when I went through the budget again, that if we could get a reduction from the school, you know, no one likes the thought of their taxes going up. No one's in favor of this. And I think, you know, the next step, once they set an override number, will, I know the selectmen have also discussed having after this, it would be a joint forum where we opened it up to the town, and we have, I don't want to say a town meeting before town meeting, but essentially that, where the town can come in and say, okay, here, why are you doing this? That's where I settled on 1.5, because if you look at it, you know, the 1.5, like I said, was a $371 increase. If you go 1.25, it's 309. So it's about a $60 difference. To find another $250,000, it's about a $60 difference a year in taxes. So,
or to your point, $15 a quarter.
Right, exactly. And for me, it went back to, I don't want to, if we're going to work together as a town, and we're going to rally support, and we're all going to come together as a town and say, hey, listen, we're willing to increase our taxes. I don't want to put us in the same position next year. So to me, that 1.5 gets us to where it's a sustainable number going forward. You know, we'll have overcome, like you said, Mike, that $500,000 hole we were in to begin with, just with the school increase.
Right.
This will take us up and over it and going forward. You know, and at some point, the town needs to decide what we are going to be. You know, we're one of the only towns that has a camp, right? We have this camp that everyone loves, that everyone wants to keep, but at the same time, it costs a lot to maintain that camp. You know, the transfer station. We're one of the few towns that still has a transfer station, a very, you know, a very active transfer station. A lot of people are switching to private hauling. You know, people want to maintain the transfer station. That's an added expense that is shared by all, but not everyone uses it. And so I think at some point, you know, everyone likes to say that we have this real small town identity, but at the same time, you can have a small town identity while at the same time, you're going to have to start to spend money to maintain all these services. And I think it's something we have to do, and we fought for a long time not to. But the change in assessment, as you said, Mike, really put us in the hole. So, Mr. Powers, thoughts on the override amount?
I mean, obviously in the end, the lower the better, right? But you know, seeing that realistic number of the 1.8 and change, and looking down to the 1.5, I have a feeling, you know, I don't want to throw out an exact number there. I'd love to get as close to that 1.5 as we can. I think the reality is going to be maybe a little north of that to give ourselves a bit of a cushion. You know, we're in a position where these committees that, you know, the rec committee, the Board of Health, and all the different groups, even the conservation groups and the historical groups and everything, they're fighting for every dollar they can get, right? And we're asking them all to take some haircuts over the past couple of years. You know, I think it's tough to ask them to continually do that. And now as a town, we've put them in a position where they're fighting each other there's only so much money to go around, right? So to give them maybe a little bit more breathing room, I'd see maybe the number go a little bit north of that. But again, to Mr. Dugan's point, in the end, is a 1.4, 1.5, 1.8, will it really make a difference when it comes down to voting? Because historically we're lucky if we get 150 people to show up. it's great that they're going to do or potentially do some sort of panel to let folks come and ask questions, but it's going to determine who shows up and asks those questions. Is it the same group of people that shows up every time, which is, it's awesome to see those folks involved, but we have several thousand people registered to vote, and a lot of these decisions are made by less than 100 people, or less than 150 people, I should say, from a quorum perspective. So in the end, we can talk all day long about this stuff. It's just who's going to show up and make those votes is going to make the difference. I hope more people show up, and I would love to see all of our registered voters show up and have a say in this thing. And whatever the result is, I say, great, that's how democracy works. But I don't think that's what's going to happen. I'd like to see it closer to the 1.5 number, but I think probably closer to 1.6 without having exact numbers in my head. We'll probably end up floating around somewhere in there, maybe.
Mrs. Werdeman, thoughts on the 1.5?
No, like I said earlier, I think that coming down from the 1.8, I don't think that the 1.5 is too, maybe like Pat said, 1.5, 1.6. I mean, it's all kind of, in terms of numbers, it's not a huge deal, but I'd like to see the 1.5, but
Okay.
I don't think it's far off, so.
Mrs. Wright, thoughts on your thoughts on setting a level or a general consensus as to where we're headed?
So I kind of agree with Patrick. I think that I think 1.5 is probably the lowest we could go. I think that it needs to be there or north of it in order to sustain, going forward.
Sure.
There, to his point, there are a lot of, departments in this town that are always looking for, additional funds. The library, like we talked about with her a couple weeks ago about how she has that, part-time person she wants to make full-time, and, just to have this small town have, decent rec program, a decent library, and, things that people in the town can enjoy, having people come in every year and be like, sorry, this is where we're at. I think 1.5 is probably the lowest we could go, in my personal opinion.
I think too, to play off of that, Amy, and something you said, Kevin, it's as a town, we got to figure out an identity. I don't think it's that, and I don't want to speak for anybody in this committee, I don't think it's that anybody wants to cut any of those services, right? We don't want to necessarily not have those things. It's like we legit aren't going to have money for that stuff, and that's going to be the consequences of not figuring this out as a town. It's not the finance committee coming out and saying, "Oh my gosh, let's close up shop and close this down and sell that off. We're going to have a garage sale around town to figure, anything that's not screwed down is getting sold. We're going to have this, moving estate sale basically for the town." That's not what our intention is, at least in my opinion. It's just that's the decisions we're going to be faced with, not only in the next year or two, but what do the next 5 years, 10 years look like? And I get it's tough times for people. We came out of a global pandemic, and every dollar counts, and there's households that can't afford some of those increases. I'd love to see long-term some sort of stabilization for homes for people that are 65 or 75 plus maybe, and that could help solve some of the solutions. But I don't know legally what they can do. That's up to the Board of Selectmen. It's not up to us and all that fun stuff. But just it's just the lower we go, the bigger problem we're going to have next year.
Sorry, go ahead, Amy.
Sorry. I was just going to say, to add to it, we really need to think about the capital improvement list and what's been on that. If there's going to be a new highway department at some point built, if any of these things that people have in their minds going down the road, if we're going to have some sort of funding to make these other things happen, cutting it as low as we can, it's just, there's never going to be enough money to improve the other things in town that people have been talking about for years. Not that and I'm not saying that a $4 or $5 million highway building, but at some point the building that the highway department is in isn't going to work for them anymore. We really need to start thinking about the future of this town and where people are going to be in 5 years from now, and not just keep solving the problem for 1 year, 1 year, 1 year, 1 year. We can't, it's not going to work. Let's just, there's not just this budget that we have to really think about in the back of our head. There are other things that need to get done. I mean, the water, and I know that water funds a lot of their stuff, but there's a huge capital, improvement plan for the water department and for other things that we actually should be thinking about in the back of our head too. Like, if we only did 1.2 million, how does that going to affect, police needing cars a year or 2 years or 3 years from now, fire trucks and all these other things? Like, there's just never going to be enough money to fill that stuff,
Yep, all good points, all good points. So, any sort of last minute discussion? This was all I had on the agenda for tonight. I think we got a lot of the questions asked. Again, I'm planning on posting for next Tuesday, so we can have that joint session with the selectmen. And once they set an override amount is when we'll go back in and start, actually, I think, moving numbers. So does anyone have any saved rounds or last minute points they'd like to make for the night?
No.
Seeing none, I will entertain a motion to close.
So moved.
Moved by Mr.
Second.
Dugan, seconded by Mrs. Wright. We'll do a roll call vote. Mr. Dugan,
Aye.
Mr. Powers,
All right.
Mrs. Werdeman,
Hi.
Mrs. Wright,
Aye.
Mr. Sullivan, aye. We are adjourned. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Hi.
Bye.
Good night.